The bustling market pulsed with life that Saturday morning, a symphony of haggling voices and clinking coins filling the humid air. Janet Thompson held her 4-year-old son David's hand firmly as they navigated through the crowded aisles, though her mind wandered to the endless list of chores awaiting her at home. She couldn't have known that in mere moments, her ordinary marketing trip would transform into the most mortifying experience of her life. The yam seller's stall, with its neat pyramids of tubers and bright wrapper decorations, caught Janet's attention. As she bent to inspect the produce, she failed to notice David's wandering gaze fixating on the vendor herself, a woman whose traditional blouse revealed just enough to spark the boy's dangerous curiosity. "Mommy, can I touch them?" David's innocent voice cut through the market noise like a blade. Janet froze, her heart skipping a beat as her son's words registered. But before she could react, David had already turned to the yam seller, his eyes wide with wonder and his small hand reaching out. "Auntie, your breasts are big like my mommy's." The market seemed to pause, as if someone had pressed a cosmic pause button. The yam seller jumped back, clutching her chest defensively, her face contorting in shock and indignation. Madam, what kind of child is this?" Her voice carried across the marketplace, drawing every eye in their direction. Janet's face burned blue with shame, her hand trembling as she yanked David's arm back. She could feel the weight of countless stares boring into her, could hear the ripple of whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Some traders snickered behind their palms, while others clicked their tongues in disapproval. But David, completely oblivious to the storm he had unleashed, looked up at his mother with innocent confusion. "But Mommy," he protested loudly, his voice carrying even further than before, "you let me touch yours at home. Why can't I touch hers?" The whispers erupted into poorly concealed laughter. The yam seller shook her head, adjusting her scarf with trembling hands. "Better talk to your child before he embarrasses you more, madam," she muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. Janet's mind raced through every possible response, but found none adequate for this situation. How could she explain that her son's inappropriate behavior stemmed from her own failure to set proper boundaries? That her inability to wean him had led to this mortifying moment? "I'm so sorry, madam," she stammered, the words feeling insufficient even as they left her lips. "I promise this won't happen again." She could barely meet the woman's eyes, knowing the judgment she would find there. Gripping David's hand tightly, perhaps too tightly, Janet hurried away from the scene, her vegetables forgotten. Her son trotted alongside her, still confused by the adult's reactions, while tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. The weight of judgment followed them through the market, carried on waves of whispers and stares. What the onlookers couldn't see was the turmoil in Janet's mind, the crushing realization that her overindulgence had led to this moment. They couldn't know about the sleepless nights spent trying to wean David, or the arguments with Michael about their son's dependency. They saw only a mother who had failed to teach her child proper boundaries, not understanding that this public humiliation was merely the culmination of years of private struggles. As they reached their car, Janet crouched down to David's level, her hand shaking as she gripped his shoulders. "David, you cannot say things like that," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and shame. "It's very rude, and you cannot touch people like that." David tilted his head, his innocent confusion only deepening. "But Mommy," he said with a pout that would have been adorable in any other context, "you always said breasts are for feeding and touching. Why is it wrong now?" Janet stared at her son, words failing her completely. In his simple question lay the heart of their problem, her own inconsistency, her inability to set proper boundaries, her failure to help him understand the difference between private and public behavior. As she buckled him into his car seat, Janet knew with crushing certainty that something would have to change, and soon. 7 years earlier, in a sterile hospital waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, Janet and Michael sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, their hearts pounding in unison. The envelope in Janet's hands might as well have been made of lead for how heavily it weighed on her. The air conditioning hummed monotonously, a sound that had accompanied so many of their disappointments before. Michael watched his wife's trembling hands, recognizing the familiar dance of fear and hope in her fingers. He had memorized this scene over the years, The way Janet would grip the test results, how she would hold her breath just before opening them, the slight quiver in her lower lip that preceded either tears of joy or despair. 7 years of negative results had taught them both the choreography of disappointment. Open it, Michael urged softly, though his own heart thundered against his ribs. In the privacy of his thoughts, he wondered if he could bear to see Janet's heart break one more time. The doctor's words echoed in his mind: diminishing chances, alternative options, managing expectations. But they had chosen to try one last time. Janet stared at the envelope, her mind racing through the possibilities. The other patients in the waiting room faded into mere shadows as her world narrowed to this single moment. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What if it's bad news again? The weight of their journey pressed down on her. The countless injections, the precise temperature measurements, the scheduled intimacy that had turned their marriage bed into a clinical endeavor. But Michael, ever her anchor, leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He knew every scar on her heart, had kissed away tears after every failed attempt, had held her through nights when she questioned whether they were being punished by fate. We've been through this before, he reminded her, his voice steady despite his own fears. We've survived. Whatever it says, we will face it together. The universe seemed to hold its breath as Janet's fingers finally broke the seal. The paper trembled as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the document. For a moment, she froze, her lips parting in a silent gasp as tears welled up in her eyes. Michael's heart stopped, preparing for the familiar crash of disappointment. Michael, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. In that single word, he heard something new, not the usual pain, but something else entirely. What is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned closer, his hand tightening on her shoulder. Janet turned to him, her face streaked with tears, but lit with an expression of pure joy that he hadn't seen in years. It's positive, she breathed. I'm pregnant. Michael stared at her, stunned into silence. The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile as soap bubbles. You're serious? He asked, his voice trembling with disbelief, though he could already see the truth shining in her eyes. She nodded, and in that instant, Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear. We did it, Janet, he whispered into her hair, his own tears falling freely now. After all these years, we did it. The waiting room dissolved around them as they clung to each other, their minds already racing forward to nursery colors and baby names. Other patients watched the scene unfold, some wiping away sympathetic tears, understanding the weight of the moment they were witnessing. The nurse at the reception desk smiled knowingly. She had seen this miracle before, but it never failed to touch her heart. That evening, they celebrated quietly at home, Michael cooking Janet's favorite meal, spaghetti with spicy tomato sauce. The simple pasta dish had been their comfort food through years of disappointment, but tonight it tasted like victory. Janet rested on the couch, her hands protectively cradling her still flat belly, while Michael moved around the kitchen with a new lightness in his step. As they sat together after dinner, Michael took Janet's hands in his eyes serious despite his joy. Janet, we've waited so long for this child, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise to do everything to make sure you and our baby are safe and happy. Janet smiled through her tears, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This baby is a gift, Michael, she whispered, squeezing his hands. I will do whatever it takes to protect him. Neither of them could have known then how those words would echo through the years, how Janet's fierce maternal instinct to protect would someday cross the line from nurturing to enabling. In that moment, they were simply two people on the brink of their greatest adventure, their hearts full of love and promise, blissfully unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, kept silent about the future difficulties their miracle would bring. It let them have this perfect moment of joy, this pure celebration of love and possibility, before the real work of parenting would begin. The first few months after David's birth unfolded in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Janet moved through those early days in a fog of exhaustion and pure love, her world narrowing to the tiny bundle that depended on her for everything. She memorized every detail of her son, The way his bright eyes locked onto hers while nursing, how his tiny fingers gripped hers with surprising strength, the perfect bow of his lips as he slept. Michael watched from the periphery as his wife and son formed their intimate bond. He noticed things that Janet, in her absorption with David, missed entirely. He saw how she would drop everything at David's smallest whimper, how she rushed to feed him before he could even cry, how she seemed to anticipate and fulfill his needs before he could express them. "You're spoiling him already," Michael observed one evening, leaning against the doorframe as he watched Janet settle into the familiar position on the couch, David latching eagerly to her breast. Janet laughed, the sound light and dismissive. "He's a baby, Michael. He needs his mommy." She stroked David's dark curls, lost in the perfection of the moment. Michael's brow furrowed slightly as he sat beside them. "I know, but—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He's going to grow up thinking you're the only person in the world. And what's wrong with that?" Janet's tone remained playful, but there was an edge to it, a defensiveness that Michael noted but chose not to challenge. Not yet. As months turned into years, Michael's early concerns proved prophetic. By the time David turned 2, Janet's attempts to wean him met with fierce resistance. The boy would cry and pound his tiny fists against her, refusing all other food, his face red with determination as he demanded to nurse. "Janet, he's not a baby anymore," Michael said one evening, watching his son cling to Janet's shirt. "He needs to eat proper food." Janet sighed, stroking David's hair as he dozed in her arms. "I've tried, Michael," she said, though they both knew her attempts had been half-hearted at best. "But he's just not ready. What am I supposed to do? Let him starve?" Michael shook his head, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. "You're letting him control you," he said, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. At family gatherings, the issue became impossible to ignore. During one Christmas celebration, the Thompson living room buzzed with conversation and laughter, until David's sharp demand cut through the noise. "Mommy, milk," he announced loudly, pulling at Janet's blouse. The room fell silent, conversations dying mid-sentence as all eyes turned to them. Janet's cheeks flushed as she tried to quiet him. "David, not now," she whispered, but her son was beyond reasoning. "Why not?" "I want milk, Mommy." His voice rose higher as he tugged harder at her clothes. Michael stepped in, attempting to pull David away. "David, you're a big boy now. You don't need milk anymore." His voice was firm, but David's cries only intensified. From the corner, Aunt Sarah's stage whisper carried clearly, "Isn't he too old for that?" Other relatives exchanged meaningful glances, their judgment palpable in the air. Janet forced a smile, trying to laugh it off. "He's just attached to me," she said lightly. But the whispers and sideways glances continued, each one a small cut to her confidence. At school, David's dependency manifested in different ways. While other children his age ran to the playground, laughing and forming friendships, David sat alone by the gate, his eyes fixed on the spot where Janet disappeared each morning. His teacher, Mrs. Adebayo, watched with growing concern as the pattern repeated day after day. During one parent-teacher meeting, Mrs. Adebayo leaned forward across her desk, her face gentle but serious. "Mrs. Thompson," she began carefully, "David is a sweet boy, but he struggles to interact with the other children. He's very attached to you." Janet nodded, her cheeks flushing with familiar embarrassment. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm trying to work on it." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Every time she tried to establish boundaries, David's tears would break her resolve, and she would find herself giving in, telling herself that there would be time for independence later. What Janet couldn't see, but what everyone around her observed, was how her love for David, pure and fierce as it was, had become a cage for both of them. Her desire to protect him from any discomfort had prevented him from developing the resilience he would need in life. Her inability to set boundaries had left him unable to understand them. The universe tried to send warnings. The concerned looks from family members, the gentle suggestions from teachers, Michael's increasingly frustrated attempts to intervene. But Janet, caught in the web of her own maternal devotion, missed these signs or chose to ignore them. It would take the public humiliation of the market incident to finally force her to confront the truth she had been avoiding, that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. The evening after the market incident, Janet sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall. The room's shadows seemed to dance with the replaying scenes of public humiliation. Now in the hall, David slept peacefully, unaware of the storm he had unleashed in his mother's heart. The sound of running water in the bathroom stopped, and moments later, Michael emerged, his face etched with concern. "Janet," he said softly, sitting beside her. The mattress dipped under his weight, but she barely noticed. "What happened today?" She drew a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "It was awful, Michael." Her voice cracked as she recounted the market scene. With each word, she relived the mortification. David's innocent question, the yam seller's shock, the crowd's judgment. Michael listened silently, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. "This has gone too far, Janet," he said finally, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to do something. He's getting older, and his behavior isn't just affecting you anymore. It's affecting him too." Tears welled in Janet's eyes. "I know," she whispered, and for the first time, she truly did know. "But I don't know where to start. I've tried to wean him, but it didn't work, and now," she gestured helplessly, "now I feel like I've ruined him." Michael placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You haven't ruined him, Janet, but we can't handle this alone anymore. We need professional help." The next morning found Janet in the waiting room of Dr. Fumi's child psychology practice. The space was designed to be welcoming, with cheerful paintings of animals on the walls and a box of toys in the corner. David sat beside her, happily playing with a wooden train, oblivious to his mother's anxiety. Janet watched him, noting how even here, in this strange place, he periodically glanced up to ensure she hadn't disappeared. Dr. Fumi, a woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, welcomed them into her office. The room felt warm and safe, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. As Janet poured out their story, the prolonged breastfeeding, David's attachment, the market incident, Dr. Fumi listened intently, her pen moving across her notepad in unhurried strokes. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Fumi said when Janet finished. "First, let me say that you are not alone. Many parents face similar challenges, especially when cultural practices and emotional bonds become intertwined." Janet felt a small wave of relief wash over her. In the doctor's gentle words, she found the first hint of understanding she'd encountered since the market incident. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll start by understanding why David is so attached," Dr. Fumi explained, glancing at the boy who was now arranging colored blocks on her carpet. "It's common for children to develop strong emotional dependencies, especially when breastfeeding is prolonged. We'll work on helping him develop independence while making the weaning process as gentle as possible." Over the next few weeks, Janet and David attended regular sessions with Dr. Fumi. They learned new routines, encouraging David to eat meals with the family instead of nursing, establishing bedtime rituals that didn't involve breastfeeding, and celebrating small victories when David showed independence. But old habits died hard. One evening, David had a particularly bad meltdown. He had been asking to nurse all afternoon, and Janet had held her ground, following Dr. Fumi's guidance. As bedtime approached, his frustration boiled over. "Mommy, please. Just one time," he cried, stamping his feet against the hardwood floor. "No, David," Janet said firmly, though her heart ached at his tears. "You don't need it anymore." "Yes, I do," he screamed, throwing himself onto the floor and kicking his legs. The sound drew Michael from his home office. Michael gently picked David up and sat him on the bed. "David, listen to me," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "You are a big boy now. Big boys don't cry for milk like babies. You can do other amazing things instead." David sniffled, looking at his father through tear-stained eyes. "But I want Mommy," he mumbled, his lower lip trembling. Janet knelt beside them, taking David's small hand in hers. She could feel Dr. Fumi's words strengthening her resolve. "David, I love you so much," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And loving you means helping you grow. You are strong, And you don't need this anymore. Something in her words seemed to reach him. Maybe it was the firmness in her voice, or perhaps it was the united front his parents presented. For the first time, David didn't fight back. He nodded slowly, his tears subsiding to quiet sniffles. Dr. Fumi had explained that progress wouldn't be linear, that there would be steps forward and back. But she had also promised that with consistency and patience, change would come. As Janet tucked David into bed that night, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but they had taken the first crucial steps toward healing. In the privacy of their bedroom later that night, Michael pulled Janet close. "You did well today," he whispered into her hair. "I know how hard this is for you." Janet nodded against his chest, letting out a shaky breath. "I keep thinking about what Dr. Fumi said, that sometimes the greatest love we can show our children is teaching them to be independent." Outside their window, the moon cast a gentle light over their garden, where David's swing set stood as a symbol of childhood freedom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since the market incident, Janet felt equipped to face them. She was learning, just as David was, that love could take many forms. And sometimes, the most powerful form was knowing when to let go. The real turning point came on a sun-drenched afternoon at the neighborhood park. Janet sat on her usual bench, her body tense with the familiar anxiety of watching David navigate the playground. But today was different. When a boy his age called out to him, waving a soccer ball invitingly, something unexpected happened. "Come on, David," the boy shouted. "It's fun." Janet held her breath, preparing herself for David's usual retreat to her side. But David surprised them both. He glanced at his mother, seeking reassurance with a quick look rather than his usual desperate dash to safety. When Janet gave him an encouraging nod, he took a tentative step toward the other child. "Go on, sweetheart," she whispered, though he was too far to hear. "I'll be right here." Within minutes, David was running across the grass, his laughter mixing with the other children's voices. Janet watched through tears of relief and joy, remembering Dr. Fumi's words about breakthrough moments. For the first time in years, she saw her son behaving like a typical boy, free from the shadows of dependency that had haunted them both. That evening, as they sat together for dinner, David made an announcement that caught both his parents by surprise. "Mommy," he declared, sitting straighter in his chair, "I don't need milk anymore. I'm a big boy now." Janet and Michael exchanged glances, their hearts swelling with pride. The journey wasn't over, but they had crossed a significant threshold. Weeks passed, and the changes in David became more pronounced. He made friends at school, participated in class activities, and even volunteered for the school play. Mrs. Adebayo, his teacher, pulled Janet aside one afternoon, her face bright with approval. "Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Thompson, it's working," she said warmly. "David is like a different child. He's engaging with his classmates, raising his hand in class. He's even helping other children who feel shy." The transformation wasn't limited to David. Janet found herself changing too, growing into a more confident mother who could love without smothering. The whispers and judgmental glances at family gatherings had been replaced by admiring comments about David's independence and social skills. One quiet afternoon, as Janet sat on the veranda sipping tea and watching David play soccer with the neighborhood kids, Michael joined her, carrying a glass of juice. The scene before them, their son running, laughing, and thoroughly enjoying his independence, seemed almost miraculous compared to where they had been just months ago. "He's really grown, hasn't he?" Michael said softly, sitting beside her. Janet nodded, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "It feels like just yesterday he couldn't stand being away from me for a second. And now look at him. So confident, so happy." "You did well, Janet," Michael said, his voice filled with pride. "It wasn't easy, but you made the right decision for him." Janet set her teacup down, her eyes still following David's movements across the yard. "I just wish I had realized sooner," she mused. "I thought I was helping him by giving in to his needs, but I was only making him more dependent. I couldn't see the bigger picture." "It's not easy to know when to let go," Michael replied gently. "But the important thing is that you did it, and look at him now. He's thriving because of it." As they watched their son play, Janet felt a new determination growing within her. I want to do more, she said suddenly, turning to Michael. I want to help other mothers understand this. I want to share our story so they don't make the same mistakes I did. Michael smiled, placing his hand over hers. That's a wonderful idea. Your experience could help a lot of people. A week later, Janet found herself standing in front of a small group of mothers at a community parenting workshop. The room was bright and welcoming, filled with women of different ages, many with young children in their arms. Her heart fluttered with nervous energy as she stepped up to the podium, but the supportive smiles from the audience gave her courage. Good afternoon, everyone, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. My name is Janet, and I'm here to share my journey as a mother. I want to talk about something that isn't always easy to discuss: learning to let go. As she recounted her story, from the joy of David's birth to the struggles of prolonged breastfeeding, from the humiliation at the market to the triumph of seeing him grow independent, she saw recognition in many eyes. Some mothers nodded in understanding, while others wiped away tears. One mother raised her hand during the question period. How did you manage to stop? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. My son is 5, and he still clings to me every moment. I don't know how to get him to let go. Janet smiled gently, remembering her own struggles. It wasn't easy, she admitted. There were a lot of tears, his and mine. But the first step was recognizing that I needed to change. I sought help from professionals, and I learned how to say no with love. It's about being consistent and firm, but also reassuring your child that they are safe and loved. Another mother spoke up about the judgment from others, and Janet shared her own experiences of dealing with family opinions and social pressure. By the end of the session, the room was filled with a sense of understanding and hope. Several mothers approached Janet afterward, thanking her for sharing her story and giving them the courage to make changes in their own lives. That evening, as Janet sat with Michael in their living room, she felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Today felt good, she said, relaxing back on the couch. If sharing my story can help even one mother, it's worth it. Michael smiled, proud of how far his wife had come. You're making a difference, Janet, and David is lucky to have you as his mother. As if on cue, David came running into the room, holding a drawing he had made at school. It showed their family, Michael, Janet, and himself, all holding hands under a bright sun. Janet pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of his hair. I love you, David, she said, her voice full of emotion. I love you too, Mommy, he replied with a bright smile, before wriggling free to show his father the drawing. In that moment, Janet felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with tears and doubts, but it had taught her invaluable lessons about love, boundaries, and the importance of letting go. As she watched her son, now a confident and happy boy, she knew it had all been worth it. Their story had become more than just a personal triumph. It was a beacon of hope for other mothers struggling with the same challenges, proving that with love, support, and courage, positive change was always possible.